everyone, it's great to be with you all today for a workshop on campus organizing for social change. My name is Lauren Bailey and I'm going to be presenting today on behalf of Pax Christi USA. As we get started, I'm going to invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat, so if you just want to share your name and where you're from, that way we can know a little bit of who's sharing this space with one another. That would be great. And to start that process, I can share about myself. So my name's Lauren Bailey, and I'm the National Field Organizer with Pax Christi USA, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm joining you all today from Washington, D.C., which is where Pax Christi USA is located. And for many people, including myself, D.C. is frequently accompanied with the thought of the hub of democracy or politics or anything of that sort. But I think it's important to note that all people in the United States are on native land, and so for D.C., this is the traditional territory of the Anacostan and Piscataway people. For me, IFTJ holds a special place in my heart because this is one of the first conferences where I came in contact with Pax Christi USA. I attended this conference as a student in 2016 and 2018 with Xavier University, which is where I went to college. And I continue to just feel affirmed and energized by the people that show up to this conference and commit themselves to the work of faith and justice. I am a firm believer in knowing that if you're going to commit to justice work, you need to have a group or community that sustains you and really nourishes your soul and cares for you. And for me, this has been one of the places that I find that most directly in the people around me. So I'm currently working with Pax Christi USA as their national field organizer. Pax Christi USA serves as the national Catholic peace movement, and they promote justice and peace within communities nationwide. One of my favorite things about my position is the ability to work with leaders that are scattered throughout the nation. So our local groups exist in parishes, religious communities, just regular neighborhood communities, and also high schools and college campuses. The high school and college groups are particularly interesting to me because they're student-driven for the most part, and their work absolutely would not be possible without the commitment of so many people like you who are already passionate about bringing change to your school and to the wider community that school is kind of situated in. Just a little background on Pax Christi USA. So the 4 initiatives that we focus on are the spirituality of nonviolence and peacemaking, disarmament, demilitarization, and reconciliation with justice, economic and interracial justice in the United States, and last but not least, human rights and global restoration. All these topics are definitely large and cover just about any issue that student organizing, I think, could be focused on, and so that presents both strengths and challenges within that. But my hope is that the depth of these topics means that our local groups are able to focus really on whatever issues they feel called to, that their strengths identify with, and also that the community calls them to focus on. To start out our conversation, it's helpful to have an understanding of what campus organizing is broadly. So, in essence, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of community organizing, and that is any collective act of mobilizing people, gathering individuals, resources, energy, power, etc., to achieve a common goal. So campus organizing definitely is a form of community organizing, but the only thing that really makes it unique from general community organizing is that it happens on campuses. And so because it happens on campuses, it exists kind of within the structures of the institution that you are at. So if you're in a high school or a college, it's working within the student orgs that exist there, or the expertise that students present there, the faculty, staff. But it also keeps in mind that each of these campuses are existing within a larger community, I think, as I mentioned before. So the neighborhood that your school is in also will impact the type of work that you're doing. Another thing that's unique about campus organizing is that you're working, for the most part, with a lot of people that are in a similar age group. So what that means then is that many people have similar life experiences, or at least have been exposed to similar social and cultural events during their upbringing. So for many of you that are in high school or college, your early teens at least have probably been accompanied with the Black Lives Matter movement, movements to end gun violence, and your first exposure probably to social movements have been one of those two, if not something else that intersects with the issues of social justice as well. As many of you are probably aware, if you haven't already experienced yourself, there's such a long history and legacy of success in social movements at the hands of student and campus organizing. Some of those movements that we can learn from and really highlight when thinking of what campus organizing can accomplish. Obviously, the civil rights movement with the student sit-ins, Black Lives Matter movement, and then also the movement against gun violence. So as highlighted before, we can look at the high school students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida who have been and continue leading the March for Our Lives movement, which is completely student-run, or was student-run. I think all of them have graduated by now, but they really amplify and mobilize the students that are in their network to create change within their communities. I'm going to put on the screen a graphic that was created by Ricardo Levins Morales, and it's titled Teach a Fish to Organize. It reads, "If you give me a fish, you have fed me for a day. If you teach me to fish, then you have fed me until the river is contaminated or the shoreline ceased for development. But if you teach me to organize, then whatever the challenge, I can join together with my peers and we will fashion our own solution." This is something that I really appreciate about organizing because it goes to show that one person maybe isn't able to harness the skills or resources necessary in order to mobilize a whole community or challenge somebody in power to create any change, but when you bring the resources of everybody that is already existing among one another together, there truly is so much strength there, and you have then the power that is needed oftentimes in order to radically create a new society. Two of the questions that you probably are asking as you are thinking about the pros and cons of doing campus organizing are A, why does it matter, and B, who benefits? So to answer the first question, I would say it's important, one, because we need people in our communities that are educated and committed to creating change within them. So as you start doing this work, you undoubtedly will start learning more about the neighborhoods that you are living in, the people that are committed to whatever institution you are at, but also the issues that people care about that you're surrounded by. And I would argue that that is essential work to community building and creating places that we can be authentically ourselves and truly live out what it is to be men and women for and with others. So who benefits? I also here would argue that everybody in the situation would benefit. So if we're looking at the different groups of people that are involved in an academic setting, there are obviously the students, and I think they probably would be the largest beneficiaries because students oftentimes are the ones who are identifying where there is room to improve. So any change that would be created would directly come from that. So if you identify an issue in your school and that then gets resolved through campus organizing, that's great for the students. And I think that is one of the most satisfying and beneficial parts of campus organizing. I would also say that the administration definitely benefits in this situation because they're able to oftentimes work with students to help amplify those voices that are already there. But also, I think students find themselves in an interesting situation here where oftentimes administrators, so faculty or staff, are prohibited from speaking out against different school situations just because they, A, are contractually obligated to be there, but also I think that their voices frequently aren't as appreciated or heard than students. So they would benefit by having their needs met also, but also being able to support you all and walk through that process with students that they are seeing. And then also I would say that the community benefits. So if there's a change going on in the community, particularly if it's one that goes outside of whatever school you're in, and it then creates an impact, whether that's directly or it's more of a wavelength effect, that then benefits the community. And also I would say future generations as well as our own generation benefit because the more people that are able to participate in this process and really hold a leadership role in community organizing efforts, the stronger our society will be for ourselves and future generations. Real quickly, before we dive into kind of how you conduct campus organizing, I want to just highlight 3 or 4 student-led movements that have been seen throughout the past 100 years or so, that their results are still felt today. So the first one that I want to highlight is the American Youth Congress, which occurred in the 1930s, but it really was a group that worked with the White House and other legislative offices to advocate for youth rights. So this was composed of youth that were all over the country. They gathered in Washington and discussed issues that really hit young adults as a whole in their 1930s. And so the main focus of theirs was the draft. And at that time, young people at the age of 18 were getting taken to war, but the voting age was 21. So the young people that came to Washington, D.C. and gathered spoke out against that discrepancy, saying that if they're getting drafted to war, they should have the same right to vote. You can't say that somebody's an adult enough to go to war, but not an adult in the sense that they have voting rights. So that was essential work of the 1930s that we all benefit from today. The next student-led movement that is really important to highlight is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, which came out of the 1960s and the beginning of the civil rights movement. So this largely derived from student-led sit-ins in North Carolina and Tennessee, but this became the organization that created a path for students to become involved with the civil rights movement. And because of SNCC, there were thousands of students that were able to find a place in activism from there. I would also like to highlight the work that I already mentioned, but on the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and March for Our Lives. One thing that I think is particularly essential about their work is that it's survivor-driven and really holds center the lived experience of people that are unfortunately way too familiar with the issue that they are trying to combat. So in their situation, March for Our Lives was derived after a shooting occurred at their school where their classmates and themselves experienced this trauma that shocked their whole community. And so immediately following that, they put their trauma and pain into action and started organizing on their campus, but also nationwide, for comprehensive gun reform. And that's something that is still a large contributor to the gun legislation advocacy that's occurring in the nation today, and that 100% would not be possible without the student involvement from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. And the last movement that I want to highlight is the Black Lives Matter movement, and this isn't something that necessarily has student groups or is student-driven in a sense that it occurs on campuses, but I think that particularly within the past couple years, this is a movement that is fueled by young people who are taking to the streets and using their education and experience and community to create racial justice and avenues where the conversation around racial justice and what a society looks like that respects people and proclaims that Black Lives Matter would look like. So I think that is an interesting example of how the Black Lives Matter movement is occurring outside in communities that students are largely fueling that effort for, but then they're bringing it into the educational setting. And I think the conversations that we're seeing in classrooms today have been completely transformed because of the involvement that we've seen from high school and college-age students who are taking to the front lines to fight for racial justice. I want to spend the bulk of our time left together kind of running through what this process looks like. So what will it look like for you all on your campuses to conduct campus organizing? And then also share an example with you all about one time that I did this on campus, and I can share some feedback about what I would do differently and what that process looked like. So similar to any community organizing, the process is going to start with you engaging your stakeholders. And just before we begin, I think it is helpful to note that the process doesn't look that different than regular community organizing, but as mentioned before, just the stakeholders that are involved in your process might be a little bit different because they're going to be skewed to your community specifically. So as I said, you're going to engage stakeholders that are specific at your school. And so some people that we mentioned earlier would be other students, maybe leaders of some student organizations, your teachers, professors, faculty, and staff, and then also the administration. because in order to truly implement any of this change, there's a large chance that you will need some sort of investment from all of those people. And that investment might look a little bit different depending on what role they're in, and you might want to bring them into the process at a different time. But just keeping in mind that as you go through this process, there will be people that you are going to invite in and have to work with in that process. So the first thing to do really before even thinking about what the change will look like is just starting to speak with members of the community. So a lot of times this work is student-driven, so it would be speaking with other students and seeing what the energy is shifted towards, where there are skills and resources available, and really who can commit to doing this work. And so once you have a good sense of who is committed to it and would be sitting around the table in these conversations and working with you, you want to make sure that if you're working on a social justice issue where there is a marginalized group and a privileged group, that it's not just people of privilege sitting around a table making decisions about how organizing should be done to change the lives of people that don't have the privilege that you do. So making sure that there is an equitable sense of voices around the table is super important, just to make sure that whatever your wishes are and whatever changes you implement are reflective of what everybody as a whole would benefit from, not just what you would, even though you wouldn't necessarily feel the repercussions of whatever is instituted. One quote that came out of the disability rights movement, I think this comes from a South African disability rights activist in the 1980s, but the quote is, "Nothing about us without us." And so I think that's the essence of community organizing, is that we don't need people sitting around the table making decisions about what issues should look like for other people. I think there already is plenty of that going on in society, but knowing that if we are going to push for a more equitable world, then we need people of all different backgrounds sitting in that space and sharing their perspective, but particularly the voices of those who would be most impacted are 100% essential to this conversation. No matter what issue you're focusing on, I think it is essential to just have some valiant effort to include voices of those who are most impacted in the space. So one issue that I focused on previously in Ohio was abolition of the death penalty. And so while our efforts were targeted towards Governor DeWine to call for him to abolish the death penalty, and obviously that's a difficult issue to pull in those voices from, we still made sure that people that had personal ties to individuals on death row or people that had ties to those that were in legislative offices, that all of those voices that would be present in that change process were on the table. So it wasn't necessarily the easiest process to do, to include those voices that are often siloed away, but that makes it an equitable process. So next up, you're going to identify what the goal is. And once again, that's going to be done with the people that are most impacted. So if this is something that's going on your campus and it's an issue that you think impacts a lot of the students, make sure that they're the ones that are either filling out a form to share what they would like to see. Make sure you maybe have a forum where people are able to voice their concerns, or some anonymous way that people are able to share what their goal is. I think with this, that's always a difficult process because change isn't necessarily welcomed by anybody, especially those in administration. So making sure that people feel comfortable when sharing what their desired goal is, especially if it's an issue that would be difficult for them to open up about. So making sure that that's in an inviting environment and you truly are listening, and not in there for any self-given reasons, but you're there to listen and learn if you don't fall into that category. So next up then would be conducting a community analysis. One that I have done was asset mapping, which was founded by John McKnight and Peter Block, and I can add a link to something that has to do with this in the chat, but they have coined the term asset mapping, and really what this is what it sounds like, but it's working in your community to figure out what skills already exist, what gifts people have, and what other people are willing to learn. And once you do this, whether you're going door to door to do it or you're just speaking with people and logging it, then you're able to see what is available in the community and what people are willing to share. And once that has been determined, then that's when the change can start, because you know what you're working with and kind of what the confines of your project would look like. Next would be design initiation. So once again, that would be using the resources that are available, whether that comes from asset mapping or a different type of community analysis, but figuring out the best way to utilize the skills, talents, gifts, etc. of what exists in your community. Similar to the previous stages, once you get to design initiation, you really want to make sure that there's adequate representation around the table, particularly with design initiation and then the consequential steps. This is when you really get action-oriented. And so if you've made it this far and you haven't had representation, this is absolutely essential now, because once you start some of those action steps, that's when even more people are going to be impacted by it, and you really just need to make sure that what you're doing is mindful at that point in order to be respectful. Once you begin the design initiation, this is when it really becomes essential that you are utilizing the resources that you have available to you. And a lot of times these are really accessible because you're a student, so honestly always use that to your advantage and make sure that you are using all the resources at hand, because this is the time in your life when there are plenty of resources and truly people that are excited and eager to help out. So the resources that you could use could be tangible, just like paper and printing, so you can make flyers and really get the word out about your issue, but it also could be less tangible resources such as faculty and staff that have expertise in whatever issue area you're focusing on, or anything like that. But truly make sure that you are reaching out to the people in your network and trying to lean on them for support whenever possible. After the design initiation has been agreed upon by members of your community and everybody that is a stakeholder, that's when it really is time to implement the plan. And so this can be done in small or large scales depending on what the project is that you're working on. But once you implement that plan, it's pretty essential that the next stage that you do is evaluating the plan. And that's when the evaluation needs to be broad in order to make sure that everybody that potentially could come in contact with your organizing is able to share their input. Because it's really easy when you're doing this work to get so caught up in the nitty-gritty details of your organizing and what you're trying to accomplish. But it's important to take a step back and see the perspective from somebody who maybe just heard about this for the first time and is encountering your work. So evaluating that becomes essential. And then maintaining the outcomes in the community is the next step. So making sure that you don't lose sight of that initial dream or goal that was decided upon by members of your team, members of the community, and stakeholders. And then that's a never-ending process, so making sure that you are constantly evaluating and tweaking your implementation to match the needs and current setting in the community is pretty important. Just make sure that it stays relevant and never loses sight of the community. The last stage of this sounds like it could be a little bit of like a research class or something like that, but it truly is just like disseminating your information and sharing it with others. And so oftentimes there aren't enough resources in a community to do multiple community assessments, so kind of cutting down on duplicating work whenever possible can go a long way in making sure that the next movement has all of the resources available to them that you potentially would have wanted when you started your process. So making sure that there is strong communication within the community can really cut back a lot of work for the next person. To provide an example of when I encountered this as a student, I was in school getting my Master's of Social Work, and part of what we do for that is a field placement that lasts the entire year, where you get real-world experience and are working pretty much a 9-to-5 job a few days a week. And so my field placement was at an intergenerational center, so we had preschoolers on one side of the building that came in every day, and their family came and their parents picked them up every day. And then we had older adults on the other side of the building that were in an adult day program. And similarly, their family would come pick them up at the end of the day. And so myself and the other students that were involved were able to have conversations with both the family members of the older adults and the parents of the preschoolers on a regular basis, getting to know them. And we started this process by creating a farmer's market where we would have produce once a week that was able to be picked up on their way out the door since everybody was already gathered in one place, so it saved a trip. And that kind of was started out of just the previous research that had been done that showed that there was low food accessibility within the area. So there weren't enough grocery stores in the zip code. There weren't any at all, actually. And everybody was left to get food from convenience stores or carry-out marts or something like that. But there just was not enough food accessibility. And so that was something that research told us, but we didn't know how to proceed until myself and the other students started having conversations with the family members. The center itself had a really good relationship with a local university that had funds and connections with individuals that were conducting research on this and would be able to provide that food on a consistent basis for the families that were involved in our program. So then the next step came to reach out to them and see whether or not they would be willing to partner. And when they were, then it just came down to creating relationships with a local food bank that we would be able to get food from, maintaining that communication with the parents and family members to make sure that what we were kind of creating and imagining was aligned with what they were thinking. So inviting them into that creative process and constantly just checking back in with them, as well as the leaders of the food pantry, who then would be very much so getting on board with our project. And so once we were able to do that, then we started and had our first food satellite, is what we called it, where enough groceries for, it was estimated to be 3 weeks for these families, was brought in and they were able to take it home with them. And so after that first month, we sat down with people that received food and also the people that helped us receive the food in the center so we could pass it out, and had a debriefing to figure out what went well, if it was helpful, if it wasn't, and kind of how we could change it for the next month. And we followed that pattern for the whole year, figuring out what the best way would be. And at the end of about 9 months, we finished it and had a good streamlined system that seemed to work for everybody. And that program still exists today. With all of that being said, I think this work deeply relies on the community that you are existing within and the people that are committed to your work. Even within the Pax Christi groups that we have in high schools and colleges, that work can look completely different from one group to the other. And that's simply because every person brings to the table their own expertise and wisdom and interests. And you want to respect that and make sure that it's work that brings you joy and gives you life while also meeting the needs of the community around you. So knowing that there is a sense of flexibility that's needed, and this isn't a one-size-fits-all by any means. Thank you all for spending a few moments with me today and sharing in our conversation about campus organizing. If you were interested in starting a local group of Pax Christi USA and doing more of this work for peace and justice within our communities in your high school or college campus, feel free to reach out to me at my email on the screen. It's lbailey@paxchristiusa.org. And I'll also invite you all to check out our social media and website just to see what we're up to. I want to close with a blessing that somebody read to me a few years ago in campus ministry, and it has continued to bring me a lot of peace and comfort when rereading it again, and I hope it brings you the same feelings. It's a Franciscan blessing. May God bless you with restless discomfort, at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may seek truth boldly and love deep within your heart. May God bless you with holy anger, at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may tirelessly work for justice, freedom, and peace among all people. May God bless you with the gift of tears, to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, starvation, or the loss of all that they cherish, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and transform their pain into joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you really can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, with God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. Thank you all. I hope you all enjoy the rest of IFTJ.